Hello. So this is the Pacific Northwest of the United States, a land of volcanoes and waterfalls and layers and layers and layers of basalt, etched through by the Columbia River. The Columbia River, which in turn was scoured by massive 500-foot floods several times at the end of the last ice age. And today there's a huge number of trails that wander through these natural areas, and also back in time through layers and layers of human and geological activity. Trails change through the year, too, as weather comes and goes. Animals migrate, flowers bloom, snow falls. Especially with global warming, you never quite know if a trail's going to look anywhere near what it looks like right now. I figure while I kind of have the chance to do it, I might as well see and experience as much of it as I can. And over the last few years, I've been able to do just that. And as an artist, I then have a compulsion to reflect back things that I've seen, either through artwork or photography or videos or whatnot. So with that as a starting point, the big question is, how do you do that when it means sorting through, like, hundreds and hundreds, sometimes a couple thousand photos? Well, first off, where might these photos come from? I mean, I have a phone, I have a Nikon camera, I recently got an Insta360 that takes, like, panoramic photos very easily. All of these are very proprietary. I've heard of an open source camera in the making called the Axiom, but I don't know too much about that. If anyone has experience with that, I'd love to know more about that. Anyway, so you're out in nature, taking photos, then you get home, and assuming you haven't dropped your memory card in a river, now you have to deal with hundreds, maybe, of photos. And these days, there's a plethora of open source tools to make art with, a lot of very strong opinions about what the best software is to use in any particular circumstance. Many a flame war has been fought over this subject. I personally tend to think no one tool is going to work for everyone or in every circumstance. You might get hired somewhere and they might use particular software. Maybe some hardware only has drivers for one platform. You never know. There's a lot of different circumstances. Using open source tools is also great in the sense that some other company is not in control of whether you can edit your own images if you happen to be poor and can't pay their subscription fees, for instance. You just need a computer that is able to run the software. That's the barrier to entry, which these days is pretty low. Okay, so let's say you've gone out hiking, you've taken a bunch of photos, now you want to edit the software, you've decided to go with open source software, have lots of photos. Next step is editing. You want to change color balance or levels, color correction, cropping, etc., etc. The particular tool I use for these tasks kind of depends on the ultimate destination of the image. Sometimes there are many different destinations. If I'm going to print out something, I'll generally want super high resolution. Other circumstances, I'll want high bit depth. Like if you have to blend several images together, having high bit depth is particularly useful. If I'm just taking photos to show relatives or post on social media or something, low resolution is fine and don't really have to do too much. The editing needs are not very high. For higher quality, such as editing from raw images out of the Nikon camera or Canons, I've been using Nikons. I don't know, it's just worked out that way. My first pass is usually to use Darktable. Darktable has a huge number of features to it, high bit depth, lots of different color profiles you can use. It's mostly easy to figure out usually. And most of the changes you make within Darktable are non-destructive too, so you can have your raw file, do a bunch of changes, and you have you can end up with several different versions that you can return to and copy the styles that produce those versions to other stuff. If that high fidelity is not needed, I'll typically go straight into GIMP. Sometimes I'll go through Darktable and then end up in GIMP just for a little extra cropping, or I'm more familiar with GIMP tools, so sometimes I can get things done faster in GIMP than in Darktable. Another common editing task is making high dynamic range images. This, for instance, is taking several different photos of the same scene at different exposure values and then stacking them together to get increased dynamic range. For real HDR, I typically use a program called Hugin, which can not only blend exposures together, but also stitch images around. So like you can take several images around in a circle and then stitch them all together to get a super wide field of view all the way around, up and down. I used to make a lot of panoramas. Now that I have an Insta360, it's so much simpler to just press a button There's still a lot of stitching errors, so if I want to be super precise, I'll still go back to Hugin and break out my fisheye for the Nikon. Another note about HDR, sometimes if you don't need like super high fidelity, you can use GIMP for quick and dirty HDR by just pumping up the shadow values and just like manually squashing down things. It's you're not going to get super precise color ramps within an image, but if you're only posting it to social media or whatever, it's an easy way to bypass breaking out heavier tools. So one note about targets. I often end up with varieties of the same image. For instance, from one source photo, you might need thumbnails, like for the web or something, or preview images. Like if you need to post something on Steam or something, that every platform has different needs for sizes and resolutions and everything. So thumbnails, the original raw files. You might want a version for print. You might want a version for websites. You might want different edits of each of those things, like if you're printing to different formats, like a wall print versus a landscape print or something. This is not an easy problem to solve. It also means that running out of storage space on your hard drive is a real issue. So far, I do not have a solution for that, other than buying more hard drives, I guess. Someday there might be a way to like genetically engineer your brain to be photographic, but that is out of scope of this talk. Another problem with having so many photos from so many places and times with so many edits is the age-old designer's problem of collating work. You end up with files like 125 underscore final 6b or something. Everyone does it. I still don't see a good way around that. It's the easiest way in the end. There's different content management systems to try to help you with that, but I've tried a couple, but nothing really makes things easier. So I end up just going back to just a basic file system, making directories by year, by month, and then sometimes by day, otherwise day and event in one file name. It's very easy to sort through those things just with the file browser. You don't need to start up some huge program that may take a while to start and be a little irritating. And it's just using file system to browse things. Very few problems doing that. For general photo management, I've been using Shotwell more or less for a couple of years. It's convenient for tagging. Sometimes it crashes for mysterious reasons on some photos. I'm not quite sure why that is. The two big ones seem to be Shotwell and Digicam for general photo collection management. I'm starting to use Digicam more. It has a few more features and seems to crash a little bit less. All I need for my purposes usually is just tagging images, which isn't super complicated. I don't need a lot of the features Digicam has, so I don't have to hunt through little buttons if I'm using Shotwell. It's very simplified. On the whole, it does more or less what I want, and it puts everything in an easy-to-parse SQLite database. So if I need to make another tool, I can just basically parse the database myself, and it's so far been pretty easy to figure out and set things up. One thing I've noticed about Digicam is that as soon as you start it, it asks you to download this massive 300 megabyte file pertaining to face recognition, but it gives you no information about what that file is. It's like, I assume it's like some kind of AI thing. It's very unclear what it is or where it comes from. Why would you, as an open source software, immediately tell people to download this giant binary file from the internet? It doesn't make me trust Digicam. It seems to be fine from what I can tell so far looking up different forum posts, but still, it's an odd choice for open source software. Some future plans I want with my own organizing of stuff is manual geotagging. I know Digicam can do that, like if you don't have your images automatically tagged with coordinates, you can insert them with Digicam. But sometimes that's not quite what I want. Like if there's a lot of, if you ever talk to a mushroom hunter, they have particular spots that they go to, but they never want to tell you where that is. Or if there's an obscure waterfall that doesn't have an established trail or something, you might want to not have the actual location out in the world. So if you have an approximate location with an error bar, essentially, kind of a fuzziness factor to the actual latitude and longitude, that would be useful to have. I'm not sure if Digicam lets you do kind of error fuzziness of location. but that's something I would like to do in the future. It's also for the future, I want to be able to interact more with OpenStreetMap's data. I have one little thing I'll demonstrate in a minute about using OpenStreetMaps with approximate locations to give a little map on web pages. It's pretty easy to set up. But I think there's more to do with that, like different trails, or OpenStreetMaps records a lot of trails already, or people have submitted all kinds of different trails, and those tend to be more accurate than Google Maps. So I tend to use OpenStreetMaps when I'm out in the wild. So that's the basics of photo editing. Another way to make art from nature is with illustration, and with illustration, you'll need often, if you're not doing just black and white ink or something, then you'll want color palettes and things like that. Sometimes I've come across in nature, you find a very nice sunset, or like a particular tree that has some interesting coloring, and you want to use the colors from what you see as the basis for a palette for an illustration. So in that case, you might want to have a reusable color palette based on that particular source photo. There's not currently any particular standard format for gradients or palettes. There's been some talk from time to time, like at the Libre graphics meeting, and a couple of flurries of activity online trying to establish a kind of a standard for colors and gradients, but it hasn't quite coalesced particularly. Like GIMP has its own format, Inkscape uses some of the GIMP formats, Krita has its own format, etc., etc. So I've been putting together a tool built in Godot that lets you create a palette or gradient from an image, or export to various common formats, like for GIMP or Inkscape or Scribus or Krita. Or there's also one called Swatchbooker. It doesn't appear to be actively developed, but that has a wide array of color formats that you can import and export. Hopefully I don't get sued by a certain corporation for similarity to one of their online tools, but I won't dwell. My intention is to integrate this kind of color palette stuff into some other software that I made called Layout, which is, I made it long ago. I kind of keep adding to it. Its development has been a little slow, but I want to incorporate this palette and gradient features to make it accessible in Layout. I used to mostly do just black and white line drawings, but now that I'm getting more into color, I'm trying to beef up the color capabilities of Layout. One of my many unfinished projects. Another aspect of illustration is collecting and referencing source photos. Sometimes I'll just have a bunch of web browser tabs open. PureRef gets an honorable mention here because it's not open source, but it is very minimal and it does one job well. To sort through images, aside from the file system, I'll often use this command line program called Feh, F-E-H. It's an extremely minimal command line program that just puts an image on the screen, and you can just go backwards and forwards through it. Zoom in, zoom out, rotate it if you want. It's very minimal. It does a few things, but I just use it to look at things because it's fast, it's easy to use, easy to access. One thing about searching for places to hike is that you learn all kinds of things about the natural world and humans' impact on it. Take the pika, for example. They live in talus slopes and hate the heat. When it's not snowed over, they stock up on moss and other plants and stick it in their little den. Then so snow falls and they're kind of in their den for the winter, and they go through the food that they've stored. Global warming is threatening these pikas since the heat will make their rocks too hot to live in, and it's difficult for them to migrate because there's usually, outside of those talus regions, there's not really anywhere they can go. So at some point, global warming is going to kind of decimate these populations. Unless some crazy genetic engineer makes the pika 100 feet tall so they can have their revenge. I'm using that kind of as sort of a mascot for this one website I've made called Hikertunist, which I'm trying to make as kind of a hiking blog, as a central place to share artwork that I've made based on going out in nature and hiking around. So I guess that brings us to what about after you've edited images, you have images laying around and you want to share them on the internet, like with the Hikertunist stuff. For that, I've been learning how to use Hugo, which is a static website generator. I've used WordPress a lot in the past. Also rolled my own at tomlechner.com, my main art site. But Hugo makes some aspects of long-term maintenance very easy and very little overhead. Well, sort of very little overhead. This is just in comparison to like WordPress and other online things. With Hugo, it's possible to simply update a few files in a Git repository, push the repo, and have a background process compile the website into the static page. You don't need any server processing or anything. It just makes the page, and then it's if you have a domain name that points to the compiled website directory, then once this process is set up, it's very quick to update a website with very minimal overhead. And if you're coming straight into web development without a lot of web development background, there's definitely a learning curve to getting everything I just said set up. But once you do, the long-term benefits are very nice. In comparison, WordPress and my own custom PHP-based solutions sometimes run into problems like your web host updates PHP or WordPress updates. There's always a chance that incompatible versions will break your website in sometimes kind of subtle ways. I've had this happen, and it sucks, and you have to go through and debug. One time I had to track down deprecated PHP calls buried in a WordPress theme before it worked again. With a static website, you generally don't really have to worry about that. It's kind of what you see is what you get. Once it gets built from the Hugo base files into the static site, it's only the static site that gets put on the actual internet, not the intermediate building files. So incompatibility, version incompatibility breakdowns like this are somewhat less likely. Plus, Hugo is a simple executable. You don't have to deal with arcane npm configuration usually. You can make it more complicated with different Java or JavaScript libraries and such. But on the whole, so far, I'm liking Hugo quite a lot. It's just easier for me to maintain and edit. A central feature of Hugo is that pages are built from markdown files, which, if you don't know, are basically specially formatted text files that are easy to render into things with light formatting like bold section headings, paragraphs, and basic blog posts or things that are like blogs. Often that's kind of all you need. In Hugo, these are very easy to extend to embedding custom features. For instance, if you go on a hike and you have the latitude and longitude, you can specify those in a post's markdown and then make a shortcode. Hugo calls them shortcodes that generates HTML of, for instance, an embedded OpenStreetMap map that I mentioned earlier. Looks kind of like this. You can do the same for panoramas that you might have generated from Hugin, not to be confused with Hugo, Hugin. You can do for panoramas, make a shortcode to take just the name of the panorama and then generate the HTML necessary to render the panorama. In this case, I found a library called Panellum that works fabulously to render 360 panoramas, just that you can drag around with the mouse. Very easy to set up, very easy to get going. I'm pretty happy with that so far. Doing that with WordPress is a bit more complicated, so yeah, I'm pretty happy with Hugo so far. So now we've talked over kind of the traditional forms of art based on nature, photography, illustration. Now let's talk a little bit about the weirder realm of video game development. As you might be able to tell, it's very easy for me to get distracted by learning new things or going to new places artistically. Well, video game development is a lot of fun in that regard because there are so many different things and to figure out, and so many different things that need to lock together. So many different kinds of artistic endeavor, music, sound effects, illustration, photography. All of these things kind of get mashed together ultimately to create a video game in the end. It's a lot of fun and really interesting. I've been dabbling with Godot for a few years now, particularly to make various stuff in VR, with a focus on giant rotating space stations. This has led me to explore various ways to populate game environments with assets derived one way or another from getting out in nature, like seeing how plants grows and playing around with tree generation and leaf generation and vines. This, for instance, is a vine tool I made for Godot. So you can just draw around in a scene, and as you can see, it's It traces out the vines and populates it with ivy. And this ivy is based on English ivy, which is a very invasive species in the Northwest. The leaves are from photos that I took pretty close to where I live. And some of the tool code that I used for the vine tool, I repurposed to be able to draw bridges between landscape elements. I'm slowly putting together a set of things to help with level design like this. So I can populate like just random levels or giant rotating spaceship levels, for instance. It's a lot of work, but it's fun to work on these things. One thing about video games versus photos or video is the interactivity of it. So that's kind of another dimension of being inspired by nature, like the interactions with wind, with rain, with snow, avalanches, water. There's so much to play with. It's a way to keep on experiencing things. Like if you sprain your ankle and you're stuck at home, or some other thing keeps you at home, you're not disconnected from things that have inspired you before. You can figure out new ways to appreciate things. One of my many unfinished art projects is a video game based around waterfalls. I started this project from scratch a couple of times so far, as there's a lot of complication with flowing water, and it's like a good way to render and show and interact with fluids, which I'm not particularly well versed in. So that's taken a while to research, and finding a good way to present that to a discerning video game audience. Well, so I guess that's kind of it for this talk. Thanks for watching.